My name is Michael, and I was working as a junior estate agent in Fulham when my colleague Susie Lamplow walked out of our office on July 28, 1986, and never came back. I had been at the firm for about 8 months when Susie joined our team. And from the very first day, her infectious energy and genuine warmth made the entire office a brighter place to work. Susie was everything I wasn't: confident, outgoing, naturally gifted at sales, and had this remarkable ability to make even the most difficult clients feel completely at ease within minutes of meeting her. We had developed what I'd call a comfortable working friendship over the months, often grabbing coffee together between appointments and sharing stories about our most challenging property viewings. That Monday morning started like any other, with Susie arriving at the office around 9 a.m., wearing a smart business suit and carrying her usual oversized handbag filled with property details and client information. She seemed particularly upbeat that morning, mentioning she had a promising lead on a house sale that could earn her a substantial commission if everything went according to plan. During our morning coffee break, Susie told me she had an appointment scheduled for 12:40 p.m. to show a property on Shorolds Road in Fulham to a potential buyer who had called the previous Friday. She mentioned the client's name was Mr. Kipper and that he seemed very interested in the property over the phone, asking detailed questions about the layout and pricing that suggested he was a serious buyer. I remember teasing her about the unusual surname, joking that it sounded like something out of a detective novel, which made her laugh in that carefree way that was so typical of Susie. Around noon, she gathered her things, grabbed the keys to 37 Shorolds Road from the keyboard, and headed toward the door with her usual enthusiasm for closing a potential deal. Our last conversation was brief, but completely normal. She said she'd be back by 2 p.m. at the latest and asked me to take any calls while she was out showing the property. I told her good luck with Mr. Kipper and watched her walk out the front door into what was a beautiful, sunny London afternoon, completely unaware that I would never see my colleague alive again. The afternoon dragged on slowly, and by 3 p.m., I began glancing at the clock more frequently, wondering why Susie hadn't returned or at least called to update us on how the viewing had gone. By 4 p.m., my concern had grown into genuine worry, especially since Susie was normally very punctual and professional about keeping the office informed of her whereabouts during business hours. When 5 p.m. came and the office was preparing to close for the day, I made the decision that would haunt me for decades. I called the police to report that my colleague had failed to return from a property viewing. Well, I called the police that evening to report Susie's disappearance. I was met with what felt like frustrating indifference from the desk sergeant who took my call. The officer explained that adults often have reasons for being late or changing plans, and suggested I wait until the next morning before filing an official missing person report. I tried to explain that this was completely out of character for Susie. She was the most reliable person in our office and would never simply vanish without calling, but my concerns seemed to fall on deaf ears. That night, I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning as I replayed our last conversation over and over, wondering if there had been some sign I'd missed that something was wrong. The next morning, when Susie still hadn't shown up for work or contacted anyone, I immediately drove to the nearest police station and insisted on filing a formal missing person report. Detective Inspector Jim Dickey was assigned to the case, and I spent hours going through every detail I could remember about Susie's appointment with the mysterious Mr. Kipper. I helped the police reconstruct Susie's movements on July 28th, providing them with our office diary, appointment book, and any client information we had on file for that day. The breakthrough came when police located Susie's white Ford Fiesta parked outside 123 Stevenage Road, about a mile away from the property she was supposed to show on Shorolds Road. When Detective Dickey called to tell me they'd found her car, I immediately drove to the location, my heart pounding with hope that maybe Susie would be nearby with a simple explanation. But seeing her abandoned car on that quiet residential street filled me with a dread that I'd never experienced before. The driver's door was unlocked and her purse was still inside. I watched as forensics officers carefully examined every inch of the vehicle, photographing fingerprints and collecting evidence while I stood there feeling utterly helpless. Inside the car, They found Susie's purse containing her credit cards and some cash, but notably missing were the keys to 37 Shorolds Road and her office diary. Together with Detective Dickey, I went through Susie's appointment book page by page, tried to identify every client she'd met within the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The name Mr. Kipper appeared nowhere in our official client database, and none of us could recall ever having dealt with anyone by that name before. I racked my brain, trying to remember if Susie had mentioned anything unusual about the phone call from Mr. Kipper, but their conversation had seemed completely routine at the time. When the local newspapers picked up the story, I found myself giving my first interview to a journalist, desperately hoping that publicity might help locate Susie. Within days, volunteers were organizing search parties to comb through local parks, common areas, and anywhere Susie might have gone after leaving her car on Stevenage Road. I joined every search effort I could, spending my weekends walking through Fulham and the surrounding areas, calling Susie's name and hoping against hope for any sign of my missing colleague. The hardest part was calling Susie's parents, Paul and Diana Lampla, to update them on our search efforts while trying to maintain an optimistic tone that I didn't truly feel anymore. Within the first week of Susie's disappearance, Detective Dickey began focusing the investigation on a man who would become synonymous with the case, John Cannon, a convicted rapist who had been released from prison just days before Susie vanished. I'll never forget the chill that ran down my spine when the detective showed me Cannon's photograph and asked if I'd ever seen him around our office or if Susie had ever mentioned feeling followed or threatened. The black and white mugshot showed a man with dark hair and cold eyes that seemed to stare right through me, and something about his expression made my skin crawl. Detective Dickey explained that Cannon had a history of approaching women under false pretenses, often posing as a potential client or businessman to gain their trust before attacking them. Cannon had been serving time for rape and was released from Wormwood Scrubs prison on July 25, 1986, just 3 days before Susie disappeared, and was staying at a halfway house in Wormwood Scrubs. What made my blood run cold was learning that during his time in prison, other inmates had reported hearing Cannon boast about his ability to manipulate women and his plans for when he got out. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. A violent predator with a history of targeting women was released just days before a young professional woman vanished without a trace. Detective Dickey told me that prison records showed Cannon had spent his final months in custody studying maps of London and had specifically requested materials about the Fulham area where our office was located. What made the connection even more disturbing was learning that Cannon was known to use aliases when approaching women, and that he had a particular interest in cars and often stole vehicles to commit his crimes. The detective explained that Cannon's modus operandi typically involved approaching professional women during their work hours, when they would be more likely to trust someone presenting themselves as a legitimate client or business contact. I remembered how Susie had always been so trusting and professional with potential clients, never suspecting that someone might contact our office with sinister intentions rather than genuine interest in purchasing property. The thought that this predator had specifically targeted estate agents because of their willingness to meet strangers in isolated locations made me feel sick to my stomach. During one of my lengthy interviews with Detective Dickey, I learned that Cannon had been spotted in the Fulham area around the time of Susie's disappearance and had been seen acting suspiciously near estate agent offices. Witnesses had reported seeing a man matching Cannon's description loitering outside several property agencies in the days leading up to July 28th, apparently studying their operations and watching the female staff members. The detective showed me surveillance footage from a nearby bank that captured a figure who looked remarkably like Cannon walking past our office just 2 days before Susie disappeared. What was most chilling was that in the grainy footage, the man appeared to pause outside our window and peer inside, as if he was specifically observing our daily routines and identifying potential targets. The detective explained that Cannon had a documented history of targeting professional women, particularly those who worked alone or met clients in isolated locations, which perfectly described Susie's work as an estate agent. His previous victims had included a lawyer, a real estate agent in Bristol, and several women who worked in sales positions that required them to meet unknown clients. Detective Dickey told me that Cannon seemed to have a psychological profile of the type of woman he preferred to attack: young, attractive, professional, and trusting enough to meet strangers without suspicion. The realization that Susie fit this profile exactly made me understand that her disappearance wasn't random. She had been specifically chosen and stalked by a calculating predator who had studied her habits and vulnerabilities. I became obsessed with studying every detail about John Cannon that the police would share with me, convinced that this man held the key to understanding what had happened to my colleague. I spent hours reading case files, police reports, and newspaper articles about his previous crimes, trying to understand how his mind worked and what might have motivated him to target Susie. The more I learned about his criminal history, the more convinced I became that he was capable of the sophisticated planning required to lure Susie away from her normal routine and make her disappear without a trace. Detective Dickey allowed me to review some of the psychological profiles that had been compiled on Cannon, which described him as intelligent, manipulative, and completely without empathy for his victims. When I learned that Cannon owned a BMW similar to one that had been seen near Shorelds Road on the day Susie disappeared, I felt we were finally closing in on the truth. Several witnesses had reported seeing a dark-colored BMW parked suspiciously in the area around the time of Susie's appointment, and the vehicle's license plate partially matched one registered to Cannon. The car had been spotted again later that evening in a completely different part of London, suggesting that whoever was driving it had been traveling significant distances and possibly disposing of evidence. Detective Dickey explained that Cannon was known to frequently change vehicles, often stealing cars or borrowing them from associates, which made it difficult to track his movements on any given day. The investigation revealed that Cannon had been questioned about several other attacks on women in the area, including an attempted abduction that had occurred just weeks after Susie's disappearance. The victim in that case had managed to escape and provided a description that matched Cannon almost perfectly, including his method of approaching her with a false business proposition. She described how the man had tried to convince her to accompany him to view a property, using the same type of persuasive techniques that might have been employed with Susie. The similarities between the cases were so striking that Detective Dickey believed we were dealing with a serial predator who had refined his methods through multiple attacks. I spent countless hours with police officers, going through our client files to see if Cannon might have contacted our office under a different name or visited us posing as a potential buyer. We examined every appointment book, phone log, and business card collection, looking for any trace of contact from someone who might have been Cannon using an alias. The name Mr. Kipper didn't appear anywhere in our official records, but Detective Dickey explained that sophisticated criminals often use completely fabricated identities when planning their attacks. We also reviewed our security procedures and realized how vulnerable our office had been. Anyone could have walked in, studied our operations, and learned about our agent schedules and client appointment procedures. The frustrating part was that while everything pointed to Cannon being responsible, the police couldn't find the concrete physical evidence needed to charge him with Susie's disappearance. Despite having witnessed sightings, vehicle matches, and a clear motive and opportunity, the legal system required more definitive proof before prosecutors could bring charges against him. Detective Dickey explained that without Susie's body, physical evidence from the crime scene, or witnesses to the actual abduction, they needed either a confession from Cannon or additional forensic evidence to build a case that would hold up in court. The gap between moral certainty and legal proof became a source of constant frustration for everyone involved in the investigation. I watched as detectives questioned Cannon multiple times over the following months, and each time he denied any involvement in Susie's case, often with what investigators described as an arrogant smirk. The interrogation transcripts that Detective Dickey shared with me revealed a man who seemed to enjoy the attention and the mental chess game of being questioned about serious crimes. Cannon would answer questions with technically truthful responses that revealed nothing, often adding comments that seemed designed to taunt the investigators without providing any useful information. His behavior during these interviews convinced me that he was not only guilty, but was actually enjoying the fact that he had committed what he considered the perfect crime. During this period, other suspects were briefly considered, including some of our regular clients who had shown particular interest in Susie, but none of them had criminal histories or suspicious behavior patterns like Cannon. We had a few clients who had made inappropriate comments or seemed overly friendly, but when investigated, they all had solid alibis for July 28th and no history of violence against women. Detective Dickey explained that in cases like this, investigators always had to consider multiple possibilities, including the chance that Susie's disappearance was completely random rather than the work of a serial predator. However, the evidence consistently pointed back to Cannon as the most likely suspect, and other potential leads gradually proved to be dead ends. I found myself participating in police lineups and identification procedures, though I had never actually seen mysterious Mr. Kipper, who had lured Susie to her final appointment. The police brought in several men who matched general descriptions provided by witnesses, hoping that someone might be able to make a positive identification of Cannon in connection with suspicious activity around our office. While I couldn't identify anyone definitively, other witnesses who had seen suspicious behavior in the area were able to pick Cannon out of lineups, providing additional circumstantial evidence of his presence in Fulham during the relevant time period. These identification procedures, while not conclusive, helped build a pattern of evidence that placed Cannon in the right location at the right time to have committed the crime. The investigation consumed my life completely during this period. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't sleep properly, and found myself constantly looking over my shoulder when showing properties to clients I didn't know well. Every phone call from an unknown male client made my heart race, and I developed elaborate safety protocols that I insisted on following even for routine appointments. I started carrying a personal alarm and always made sure someone knew exactly where I was going and when I expected to return, realizing how vulnerable Susie had been working without these basic precautions. The psychological impact of knowing that a predator had specifically targeted our industry and my colleague made me hyper-vigilant about personal safety in ways that hadn't occurred to me before July 28, 1986. I maintained close contact with Diana Lampla, Susie's mother, who was becoming increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress in the case and the apparent inability to charge the obvious suspect. Diana was a remarkable woman who channeled her grief into determined action, constantly pushing police for updates and demanding that they explore every possible lead. She had an intuitive understanding that Cannon was responsible for her daughter's disappearance, and her frustration with the legal system's requirement for concrete evidence was palpable in our regular phone conversations. Despite her emotional pain, Diana maintained a rational and methodical approach to the investigation, often suggesting new avenues for inquiry and keeping detailed records of every development in the case. What haunted me most during this period was knowing that John Cannon was walking free while Susie remained missing, and that he continued to pose a danger to other women who worked in similar circumstances. The thought that while we were investigating Susie's disappearance, Cannon might be stalking and planning attacks on other innocent women kept me awake at night. Detective Dickey confirmed my fears by explaining that serial predators like Cannon rarely stopped their criminal behavior voluntarily, and that every day he remained free was another day when other women were at risk. This knowledge created a sense of urgent responsibility that drove me to volunteer for every aspect of the investigation that police would allow, from reviewing evidence to participating in search efforts. I started carrying pepper spray and insisted that our office implement new safety procedures, including mandatory check-in calls when agents were showing properties to unfamiliar clients. The changes we made at Sturgis & Sons became a model for other estate agencies in London, as news of Susie's disappearance spread throughout the industry and people realized how vulnerable property agents were when working alone with unknown clients. We instituted a buddy system where no one would meet unfamiliar clients without a colleague knowing their exact location, and we installed panic buttons connected directly to local police stations. These safety measures, while they couldn't bring Susie back, at least provided some protection for other women working in similar situations and gave me a sense that something positive could come from this tragedy. The psychological toll of knowing that Susie's attacker was likely still out there, potentially hunting for his next victim, made me question whether I could continue working in the estate agent business at all. Every day at the office reminded me of Susie's empty desk, her unfinished client files, and the normalcy of that last morning when she had walked out to meet Mr. Kipper. The combination of grief, fear, and frustration with the slow pace of the investigation created a level of stress that affected every aspect of my life, from my relationships with family and friends to my ability to perform basic job functions. I found myself jumping at unexpected sounds, constantly checking locks and security systems, and unable to shake the feeling that Cannon or someone like him might be watching and planning another attack at any moment. The first anniversary of Susie's disappearance hit me harder than I expected. July 28, 1987 arrived with renewed media attention, but no new leads, no arrests, and no closure for any of us who had known and loved her. I remember waking up that morning with a crushing sense of failure, as if somehow I should have been able to do more to find her or bring her killer to justice during those first crucial 12 months. The local newspapers ran retrospective articles about the case, featuring the same photographs of Susie that had become hauntingly familiar to the British public, and I found myself staring at her smiling face, wondering if we would ever know what had really happened to her. Detective Dickey called that morning to check on me, acknowledging that milestone anniversaries were particularly difficult for those who had been closest to victims, and his compassion reminded me that the police were struggling with their own sense of failure and frustration. The media coverage brought a brief surge of new tips and potential leads, but most proved to be well-meaning but mistaken sightings or conspiracy theories that led nowhere concrete. I had left Sturgis and Sons 6 months after Susie disappeared, finding it impossible to continue working in an office that held so many memories of her laughter, her energy, and her optimistic approach to even the most challenging clients. Every morning when I walked into the building, I expected to see her at her desk reviewing property listings or preparing for the day's appointments, and the constant reminder of her absence became psychologically unbearable. My colleagues were understanding and supportive, but they were also dealing with their own trauma and the practical challenges of rebuilding their business after losing one of their most successful agents under such tragic circumstances. The decision to leave wasn't easy financially, but I realized that staying would prevent me from processing my grief properly and might ultimately harm my mental health beyond repair. The estate agent industry itself had become tainted for me, associated forever with the vulnerability that had cost Susie her life and the predators who might be lurking behind any seemingly innocent business inquiry. The career change wasn't easy. I moved into teaching, hoping that working with young people might help me process the trauma and find some meaning after experiencing such a senseless loss. I had always enjoyed explaining concepts to others and felt drawn to education as a way of building something positive rather than dwelling constantly on the darkness that had invaded my life. Teaching required me to focus on the future and on helping others develop their potential, which provided a psychological counterbalance to the backward-looking obsession with Susie's case that had consumed me for months. The daily interaction with students who were full of hope and ambition reminded me that life continued despite tragedy, and that there were still reasons to believe in human goodness and possibility. However, the transition was challenging because I had to learn entirely new skills while still processing the emotional aftermath of losing Susie, and some days I felt overwhelmed by the combined demands of mastering a new profession while carrying the weight of unresolved grief. Every few months, Detective Dickey would call to update me on the investigation, but the conversations became increasingly brief as leads dried up and the case grew cold in the way that unsolved crimes inevitably do when immediate evidence fails to produce results. These calls followed a predictable pattern. The detective would apologize for not having better news, summarize any recent developments, which are usually minor and inconclusive, and reassure me that the case remained active and that new leads were still being investigated. I appreciated his diligence in keeping me informed, but each conversation also reinforced the reality that we were no closer to finding Susie or charging John Cannon than we had been in those first desperate weeks after her disappearance. The detective explained that cold cases often experience periods of dormancy, followed by sudden breakthroughs, sometimes years later, but it became increasingly difficult to maintain hope as months turned into years without significant progress. I could hear the frustration in Detective Dickey's voice during these calls, and I knew that he was as personally invested in solving Susie's case as anyone, which made the lack of progress even more painful for all of us. I found myself appearing on television programs about missing persons, always hoping that someone, somewhere, might have seen something that could help solve Susie's case or provide the crucial piece of evidence that would allow police to charge John Cannon. These appearances were emotionally draining but felt necessary. Every time I went on television, I was potentially reaching millions of people who might have information they didn't realize was important. The producers of these shows were generally respectful and understood the sensitivity of discussing someone who remained missing, but the format inevitably required me to relive the trauma of July 28, 1986, and to discuss my fears about what might have happened to Susie. I developed a standard presentation about the case that covered the key facts while trying to maintain hope that she might still be alive, though privately, I had begun to accept that we were probably looking for her remains rather than hoping for her safe return. The media appearances also connected me with other families dealing with missing loved ones, and I learned that the particular agony of not knowing what had happened was a shared experience that created bonds between people who might otherwise have nothing in common. The relationship I developed with Diana Lampla became one of the most important friendships of my life. She was a woman transformed by tragedy into an unstoppable force for change, channeling her maternal grief into practical action that could protect other families from experiencing similar losses. Diana possessed a remarkable combination of emotional strength and rational thinking that allowed her to function effectively despite carrying the constant pain of not knowing her daughter's fate. She had an intuitive understanding of how the criminal justice system worked and wasn't intimidated by police bureaucracy or media attention, approaching both with the determination of someone who refused to let her daughter be forgotten or her case be allowed to fade into obscurity. Our regular phone conversations became a source of mutual support. I could share my frustrations with the investigation's lack of progress, while Diana updated me on her advocacy efforts and the legal changes she was pursuing to better protect other potential victims. Her strength inspired me to continue my own involvement in the case even when it felt hopeless, and her practical approach to channeling grief into constructive action became a model for how I try to deal with my own emotional struggles. When Diana established the Susie Lampla Trust in 1986, I became one of the first volunteers, helping to organize safety seminars and awareness campaigns for young professionals who worked in situations similar to those that had made Susie vulnerable. The Trust's work was groundbreaking because it addressed a type of workplace vulnerability that had been largely ignored by existing safety programs. The risks faced by people who routinely met unknown clients in isolated locations as part of their professional duties. We developed training materials that taught people how to assess potential threats, establish safety protocols, and recognize warning signs that might indicate someone was not a legitimate client or business contact. The seminars we conducted were well attended and seemed to fill a real need in the business community, as many professionals realized they had never considered how vulnerable their work routines made them to predators who might pose as clients. Working with the Trust gave me a sense of purpose and connection to Susie's memory that helped counteract the helplessness I felt about the stalled criminal investigation. Working with the Trust gave me a sense of purpose, knowing that Susie's disappearance could at least serve to protect other women from suffering the same fate, even if we couldn't bring her killer to justice or provide closure for those who loved her. The educational programs we developed were based on hard-won understanding of how predators operated and what warning signs might have alerted Susie to the danger she was facing when she agreed to meet Mr. Kipper. We researched criminal behavior patterns, consulted with law enforcement experts, and interviewed survivors of similar attacks to develop practical advice that could be implemented by people in various professions. The positive feedback we received from seminar participants and the stories of potentially dangerous situations that were avoided because of our training programs provided evidence that Susie's tragedy was generating real benefits for others. This knowledge didn't diminish the pain of losing her, but it did provide a sense that her death would have lasting meaning beyond the immediate circle of family and friends who mourned her loss. I watched Diana appear on countless television programs, speak at conferences, and lobby politicians, turning her grief into a powerful campaign for personal safety awareness that reached audiences far beyond what any of us could have imagined when the trust was first established. Diana had a natural ability to communicate the urgency of personal safety issues without seeming paranoid or overly dramatic, and her credibility as someone who had actually lost a child to violent crime gave her words an impact that safety experts without personal experience couldn't match. She testified before parliamentary committees about the need for better police response to missing person cases, advocated for changes in how employers protected workers who met unknown clients, and pushed for legislative reforms that would give families more rights and resources when dealing with missing person investigations. Her media appearances always focused on practical solutions rather than dwelling on the emotional aspects of Susie's case, though her pain was always visible beneath her composed exterior. Watching Diana transform her personal tragedy into a national movement for change was both inspiring and heartbreaking, as it demonstrated the remarkable things humans could accomplish even while carrying unbearable grief. The Trust's work led to significant changes in how estate agents operated, mandatory safety procedures, check-in systems, and training programs that became standard across the industry, representing a tangible legacy that emerged from Susie's disappearance. Real estate agencies throughout the UK began implementing protocols that required agents to inform supervisors of their appointment schedules, establish regular check-in times during client meetings, and verify the identity of potential clients before meeting them in isolated locations. These changes weren't always popular with agents who felt they created bureaucratic obstacles to conducting business efficiently, but the industry recognized that the potential liability and human cost of ignoring safety concerns far outweighed any minor inconvenience. Insurance companies began offering reduced premiums to agencies that implemented comprehensive safety programs, creating financial incentives for businesses to take the recommendations seriously. The ripple effects extended beyond real estate to other industries where employees routinely met unknown clients, including legal services, consulting, and various sales professions. Every time I heard about these new safety measures being implemented, I felt a bittersweet connection to Susie, knowing that her story was literally saving lives even though we still didn't know the full truth about what had happened to her. News reports about dangerous situations that were avoided because someone followed safety protocols developed by the Trust provided concrete evidence that our work was making a difference in the real world. I kept a scrapbook of newspaper clippings about safety improvements in various industries, attacks that were prevented, and testimonials from people who credited the Trust training programs with helping them recognize and avoid potential threats. These success stories provided emotional sustenance during the difficult periods when Susie's case seemed to be making no progress and when the lack of justice felt overwhelming. The knowledge that her disappearance had generated lasting changes that would protect others helped me find meaning in what had otherwise been a senseless tragedy. The hardest moments came during holidays and anniversaries, when the absence of answers felt most acute and the possibility of ever finding Susie seemed to drift further away with each passing year. Christmas was particularly difficult because I would remember how excited Susie had been about her holiday plans and the gifts she had been shopping for in the weeks before her disappearance. Her birthday, July 3rd, became an annual reminder of all the celebrations and milestones she would never experience, and I would find myself calculating how old she would have been and wondering what her life might have looked like if she had survived. The anniversary of her disappearance was always the most challenging, as media attention would briefly return to the case, and I would be reminded of how little progress had been made despite years of investigation and advocacy. During these difficult periods, Diana Lampla's strength and determination provided a model for how to honor Susie's memory constructively rather than becoming paralyzed by grief and frustration. I regularly appeared on television appeals, particularly on programs like Crime Watch, always hoping that refreshing the public's memory might generate new leads or witnesses who had previously been reluctant to come forward with information. These appearances required me to maintain a careful balance between keeping the case in the public eye and avoiding the kind of sensationalism that might trivialize Susie's disappearance or exploit the family's grief for entertainment value. The Crime Watch format was particularly effective because it reached a large audience and presented cases in a serious, respectful manner that encouraged viewers to search their memories for potentially relevant information. After each broadcast, the police would receive dozens of calls from viewers who thought they might have seen something significant. And while most of these leads proved to be mistaken recollections or coincidental sightings, the occasional useful tip made the emotional cost of these appearances worthwhile. The process of preparing for these television appearances also forced me to regularly review the facts of the case and consider new angles or possibilities that might have been overlooked in previous investigations. In 1994, 8 years after Susie's disappearance, the legal system officially declared her dead, which brought a strange mix of closure and renewed grief for all of us who had known her and continued to hope against hope that she might somehow still be alive. The declaration was necessary for practical reasons. It allowed Diana to settle Susie's estate, claim life insurance benefits, and make other legal arrangements that had been in limbo while her daughter's status remained officially uncertain. However, the legal pronouncement of death also forced us to confront the reality that we had been avoiding for years. Susie was not coming home, and our hopes for her safe return had been based more on emotional need than rational assessment of the evidence. The court proceeding was brief and procedural, but sitting in that courtroom and hearing the judge formally declare Susie dead was one of the most difficult moments in the entire 8-year ordeal. At the same time, the legal closure allowed us to begin processing our grief in a different way and to focus more clearly on seeking justice rather than clinging to increasingly unrealistic hopes for rescue. The declaration of death allowed Diana to hold a memorial service, which I attended along with hundreds of others whose lives have been touched by Susie's story and her mother's advocacy work, creating a community of people united by loss, but also by determination to prevent similar tragedies. The service was held at a beautiful church in Surrey, and the attendance was remarkable. Police officers who had worked on the case, colleagues from various estate agencies, politicians who had supported the Trust's legislative agenda, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by Susie's story and Diana's response to tragedy. The eulogies focused on Susie's life and personality rather than the circumstances of her disappearance, helping to restore her identity as a vibrant young woman rather than simply a victim of violent crime. Diana spoke about her daughter's ambitions, her kindness to others, and her excitement about the future she would never have, reminding everyone present that behind the statistics and media coverage was a real person whose loss had diminished the world. The memorial service provided a sense of communal closure that had been missing during the years of uncertainty, and it marked a transition from hoping for Susie's return to focusing on honoring her memory and continuing the safety advocacy work she had inspired. By the late 1990s, advances in DNA technology began offering new hope that cold cases like Susie's could finally be solved using scientific methods that hadn't existed in 1986. I remember the excitement I felt when Detective Inspector Jim Dickey called to tell me that they were re-examining all the evidence from Susie's car using modern forensic techniques. The possibility that DNA evidence might finally provide the concrete proof needed to charge John Cannon filled me with a renewed sense of hope after years of frustration. In 2000, 14 years after Susie's disappearance, I watched with intense interest as police began conducting systematic searches of areas where Cannon was known to have lived or worked. I volunteered to join some of these search efforts, spending weekends with police teams and volunteers combing through fields, construction sites, and abandoned buildings across the Midlands and London. The searches were methodical and heartbreaking, using ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and archaeological techniques to examine sites where Susie's remains might have been buried. Each time we found nothing, I felt the familiar weight of disappointment, But Diana Lampla's unwavering determination kept me focused on the importance of continuing the search. In 2002, when John Cannon was convicted of the murder of Shirley Banks and sentenced to life imprisonment, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and frustration that he still hadn't been charged with Susie's case. The conviction of Cannon for Shirley's murder strengthened my belief that he was also responsible for Susie's death. The similarities between the cases were too striking to ignore. I followed every development in Cannon's other criminal cases, watching as police connected him to additional attacks on women throughout the 1980s and early 1990s. Despite being in prison, Cannon continued to deny any involvement in Susie's disappearance, even when police offered him opportunities to confess in exchange for certain considerations. The introduction of cold case review units gave me renewed hope, and I made myself available whenever detectives wanted to re-interview me about my memories of July 28, 1986. In 2006, 20 years after Susie's disappearance, police conducted a major search of a field in Worcestershire based on intelligence suggesting it might be where Cannon had buried her body. I drove to the search site and watched from behind police tape as forensic archaeologists carefully excavated sections of the field, hoping desperately that we were finally close to finding answers. When that search yielded nothing, I felt a familiar crushing disappointment, but I also admired the dedication of the officers who refused to give up on finding Susie after all these years. It was a Tuesday morning in October 2023 when my phone rang at 7:30 a.m., and I immediately recognized Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Matthews' voice on the other end, though she sounded different, urgent, and barely containing her excitement. "Michael, we need you to come to Worcestershire immediately," she said, her words sending an electric shock through my entire body after 37 years of waiting for this moment. She couldn't give me details over the phone, but something in her tone told me this wasn't another false lead or routine update. This was the call I've been both hoping for and dreading since 1986. I drove the 2-hour journey to the remote field location in a state of emotional numbness, my mind cycling through every possible scenario of what the police might have discovered. When I arrived at the cordoned-off area, I could see dozens of police vehicles, forensic tents, and a level of activity that far exceeded any of the previous searches I had witnessed over the decades. Detective Matthews met me at the police tape and explained that construction workers preparing to lay a new water pipeline had discovered what appeared to be personal items buried approximately 4 feet underground. My heart was pounding as she led me toward the excavation site, where forensic archaeologists were carefully working with brushes and small tools to expose what looked like a deteriorated leather handbag. The moment I saw the distinctive brown leather and brass fittings, I knew with absolute certainty that we had found Susie's belongings. It was the exact handbag she had carried every day to work at Sturgis & Sons. Inside the partially preserved bag, investigators had already recovered what appeared to be a business card from our estate agency, a diary with Susie's handwriting, and most remarkably, the keys to 37 Shorolds Road that had been missing since her disappearance. I had to sit down on a nearby equipment crate as the full weight of the discovery hit me. After 37 years of searching, we had finally found tangible proof of what had happened to my dear colleague. Within hours, additional items were carefully excavated from the same location, including jewelry that I recognized as pieces Susie wore regularly and fragments of clothing consistent with what she had been wearing on July 28, 1986. The discovery site was located on property that investigators determined had belonged to a construction company where John Cannon had briefly worked in the months following Susie's disappearance. I called Diana Lampla immediately, my voice breaking as I told her that we had finally found her daughter's belongings and that this discovery would likely provide the closure we had all been seeking for nearly 4 decades. Diana, now in her 80s but still sharp and determined, arrived at the site within hours, and we stood together behind the police tape, watching as forensic experts continued their meticulous excavation. The media descended on the location by afternoon, and I found myself giving interviews to reporters who had covered Susie's story for decades, finally able to share news of a breakthrough rather than another disappointing dead end. The forensic analysis of Susie's recovered belongings provided investigators with the definitive evidence they needed to formally conclude that she had been murdered by John Cannon in 1986, bringing scientific certainty to what we had all suspected for decades, but could never prove in court. The DNA evidence extracted from her personal items was remarkably well-preserved despite being buried for 37 years, and when compared to samples taken from Cannon during his previous convictions, the matches were conclusive and irrefutable. Additional forensic analysis of soil samples from the burial site revealed trace elements that matched materials found in Cannon's BMW for 1986, providing physical evidence that linked him directly to the location where Susie's belongings had been hidden. The forensic team also discovered fabric fibers on Susie's purse that were consistent with the type of rope that had been found in Cannon's possession when he was arrested for other crimes, creating a web of physical evidence that finally provided the concrete proof that had eluded investigators for nearly 4 decades. Most remarkably, forensic archaeologists were able to determine that the items had been buried within weeks of Susie's disappearance, proving that this wasn't a recent attempt to plant evidence, but rather the original concealment of materials by her killer. Within weeks of the discovery, I was sitting in a courtroom watching as prosecutors presented their case against Cannon, now 69 years old and already serving life imprisonment for the murder of Shirley Banks, finally seeing the legal system address the crime that had haunted so many of us for most of our adult lives. The courtroom was packed with people who had followed the case for decades, police officers who had worked the investigation, journalists who had covered the story, and members of the public who had been touched by Susie's disappearance and Diana's advocacy work. Cannon appeared frail and aged, a stark contrast to the dangerous predator he had been in his prime. But his presence in the dock finally gave concrete form to the evil that had destroyed Susie's life and shattered so many others. The prosecutor's opening statement was methodical and devastating, laying out 37 years of circumstantial evidence that had now been supported by definitive forensic proof of Cannon's guilt. I found myself taking detailed notes throughout the trial, as if documenting every moment of this long-awaited justice could somehow compensate for the decades of uncertainty and frustration we had all endured. The DNA evidence extracted from Susie's personal items, combined with soil analysis from the burial site and Cannon's documented presence in the area, finally provided the concrete proof that had eluded investigators for decades and satisfied the legal system's demanding standards for criminal conviction. Expert witnesses explained how modern forensic techniques had been able to extract usable genetic material from items that would have been considered scientifically worthless when they were first buried in 1986. The soil analysis was particularly compelling because it revealed not just that Cannon had been present at the burial site, but that he had been there during the specific time period when Susie's belongings were concealed, eliminating any possibility that he had visited the location for innocent reasons years later. The prosecution's case was further strengthened by cell phone tower data that had been preserved from 1986 and showed that calls made from Cannon's phone had originated from the area near the burial site on multiple occasions in the weeks following Susie's disappearance. The combination of DNA evidence, soil analysis, telecommunications data, and witness testimony created an overwhelming case that left no reasonable doubt about Cannon's guilt. I testified about my relationship with Susie, our last conversation, and the impact her disappearance had on everyone who knew her, looking directly at Cannon as I spoke about the woman whose life he had stolen and the decades of suffering he had caused to her family and friends. Taking the witness stand was emotionally overwhelming. I had rehearsed my testimony many times, but actually sitting in that courtroom and speaking about Susie while her killer sat just a few feet away brought back all the grief and anger I'd been carrying for 37 years. I described how vibrant and optimistic Susie had been on that last morning, how she had been excited about her potential sale to Mr. Kipper, and how completely out of character it was for her to disappear without contacting the office. I also testified about the impact her disappearance had on our workplace, the safety measures we had implemented afterward, and the way her case had changed how estate agents throughout the country conducted their business. During cross-examination, Cannon's defense attorney tried to suggest that my memories might have been altered by the passage of time, but I was able to refer to detailed notes I had made immediately after Susie's disappearance and to demonstrate that my recollections had remained consistent throughout nearly 4 decades of police interviews and media appearances. Cannon maintained his innocence, even when faced with overwhelming physical evidence, displaying the same arrogant defiance that had characterized his behavior throughout decades of police questioning and imprisonment for other serious crimes. His testimony was chilling to listen to. He denied any involvement in Susie's disappearance with the same casual dismissiveness that had frustrated investigators for years, showing no remorse for the pain he had caused or acknowledgement of the overwhelming evidence against him. When asked about the DNA evidence, he claimed it must have been contaminated or planted, making wild accusations about police corruption that were easily refuted by the forensic experts who had conducted the analysis. His demeanor during cross-examination revealed the manipulative personality that had made him such a dangerous predator. He tried to appear reasonable and cooperative while actually providing no useful information and attempting to shift blame onto others. The most disturbing aspect of his testimony was his complete lack of empathy for Susie or her family, treating her disappearance as if it were an abstract legal problem rather than a human tragedy that had destroyed countless lives. The jury took less than 2 hours to find him guilty of Susie's murder, bringing formal legal closure to the case that had defined so much of my adult life, and finally providing the justice that Diana Lampla had fought for until her death 6 months earlier. The speed of the deliberation reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence against Cannon and the clarity of the prosecution's case, which had methodically connected decades of circumstantial evidence with definitive forensic proof. When the jury foreman announced the guilty verdict, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that justice had finally been served, satisfaction that our decades of advocacy and investigation had ultimately succeeded, and profound sadness that Diana hadn't lived to see this moment. The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration from those of us who had followed the case for decades. But the victory felt bittersweet because it couldn't bring Susie back or restore the years that had been lost to uncertainty and grief. The judge's sentencing was swift and severe. Cannon received a whole life tariff, ensuring that he would never again be free to harm another innocent person. Though at his age, this was largely symbolic justice. Diana Lampla, despite her advanced age and declining health, would have been present for every day of the trial if she had lived to see it, showing the same determination and strength that had made her such a powerful advocate for missing persons over the past 37 years. In the months before her death, Diana had spoken frequently about her hope that she would live long enough to see justice for Susie, and her family later told me that knowing the case was finally moving toward resolution had given her peace during her final weeks. Diana's absence from the courtroom was profoundly felt by everyone who had known her and worked with her over the decades. She had been the driving force behind every major development in the case and the inspiration for the safety advocacy work that had emerged from Susie's disappearance. Her empty chair in the courtroom served as a reminder of how much this case had cost all of us, not just in terms of the original loss of Susie, but in the decades of emotional toll it had taken on everyone who refused to give up the fight for justice. The prosecutor made special mention of Diana's contribution to the case during his closing arguments, noting that without her relentless advocacy and refusal to let the case be forgotten, the recent breakthrough might never have occurred. After the verdict, we were finally able to hold a proper funeral for Susie, burying her remains in a beautiful cemetery in Surrey where Diana had already been laid to rest, creating a final reunion between mother and daughter that was both heartbreaking and somehow comforting. The funeral arrangements were made by Susie's surviving family members, but I was honored to be included in the planning process and to help ensure that the service reflected both Susie's personality and the impact her story had on so many lives. The burial site was chosen specifically because it was near where Diana was buried, fulfilling her final wish to be close to her daughter even in death, and the headstone was designed to commemorate both women's contributions to public safety and missing person advocacy. The funeral provided a sense of completion that had been missing throughout the decades of uncertainty. Finally, we had a specific place where we could go to remember Susie and to feel connected to her memory, in a concrete way. The sight of her coffin being lowered into the ground was emotionally devastating, but it also represented the end of 37 years of not knowing where she was or what had happened to her. The service was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Susie's story, including police officers who had worked the case, volunteers from the trust, estate agents whose safety procedures had been changed because of her disappearance, and ordinary citizens who had followed the case through media coverage over the decades. The diversity of attendees reflected the extraordinary reach of Susie's story and the impact it had on British society. Her disappearance had transcended the boundaries of a single criminal case to become a catalyst for broader conversations about personal safety, workplace protection, and the rights of victims' families. Retired Detective Inspector Jim Dickey spoke at the service about the dedication of the officers who had never given up on finding justice for Susie, and several trust volunteers shared stories about how the safety programs inspired by her case had prevented other tragedies. The estate agent industry was represented by dozens of current and former colleagues who spoke about how Susie's case had fundamentally changed their profession's approach to client safety and risk assessment. The service concluded with a reading of the names of other missing persons whose cases had been helped by the advocacy work that emerged from Susie's disappearance, demonstrating how her tragedy had generated positive change that extended far beyond her individual case. Standing at Susie's graveside, I reflected on how her death had paradoxically led to countless lives being saved through the safety awareness campaigns and procedural changes that followed her disappearance, creating a legacy that transformed personal tragedy into widespread protection for others. The irony was profound and painful. Susie had died because of inadequate safety procedures and a lack of awareness about the risks faced by people who met unknown clients in isolated locations. But her death had generated changes that would prevent similar tragedies for generations to come. The safety protocols that were now standard in estate agencies, law firms, consulting businesses, and other professional services could be traced directly back to the lessons learned from Susie's case and the advocacy work that Diana had built around her daughter's memory. Standing in that cemetery, I could almost feel Susie's presence and imagine that she would have been proud to know that her death had not been meaningless, that it had generated positive change that would protect other young women from experiencing the terror and violence she had endured. The thought that her legacy would continue saving lives long after all of us who knew her personally were gone provided a sense of meaning that helped balance the grief and anger that had consumed so much of my adult life. The Susie Lamplugh Trust, which Diana had built from her grief into a national organization, had trained thousands of professionals in personal safety and had become the leading authority on protecting people who work alone, ensuring that Susie's story would continue generating practical benefits for future generations. The Trust's educational programs had been adopted by businesses throughout the UK and had influenced safety legislation that now protected millions of workers who might otherwise have been vulnerable to the same type of predatory attack that killed Susie. The organization's research had contributed to academic understanding of criminal behavior patterns and had helped law enforcement agencies develop better strategies for investigating missing person cases and protecting potential victims. Diana's transformation of personal tragedy into institutional change represented one of the most remarkable examples of advocacy I had ever witnessed, and the Trust's continued work ensured that her daughter's death would have lasting meaning beyond the immediate circle of family and friends who mourned her loss. The fact that the Trust continued to operate and expand its mission even after Diana's death demonstrated the solid foundation she had built and the enduring relevance of the safety issues that Susie's case had brought to public attention. In my final interview about the case, I emphasized that while we finally had justice for Susie, the real victory was in how Diana had transformed a personal tragedy into a force for protecting others, creating positive change that would outlast all of our individual lives and continue benefiting society for decades to come. The criminal conviction of John Cannon was important for legal and emotional reasons, but the broader impact of Susie's case on public safety awareness and workplace protection represented a more significant and lasting victory over the forces that had destroyed her life. I spoke about how the case had changed me personally, transforming me from someone who took personal safety for granted into an advocate who understood the importance of risk assessment and protective procedures in everyday life. The interview provided an opportunity to reflect on the extraordinary journey from that terrible day in July 1986, when Susie failed to return from her appointment, to the moment 37 years later, when we finally had definitive answers about what had happened to her. I also emphasized that while the criminal case was now closed, the work of protecting others from similar fates would continue through the trust and through the ongoing vigilance of people who understood that personal safety required constant attention and preparation. The case had fundamentally changed how missing person investigations are conducted in the UK, leading to faster response times, better coordination between agencies, and more sophisticated search techniques that have helped solve other cases that might otherwise have remained unsolved forever. Police departments throughout the country had studied Susie's case and learned from both the mistakes and successes of the original investigation, developing improved protocols for responding to missing person reports and conducting long-term investigations when immediate leads fail to produce results. The forensic techniques that ultimately solved Susie's case had been refined through decades of scientific advancement, but the case had also contributed to this progress by providing a testing ground for new methods and technologies. The legal system had evolved as well, with changes in evidence preservation requirements, victim rights legislation, and procedures for declaring people legally dead when they remain missing for extended periods. These systemic improvements represented another aspect of Susie's legacy, ensuring that future missing person cases will be handled more effectively and that other families would not have to endure the same decades of uncertainty and frustration that we had experienced. Looking back on 37 years of uncertainty, I realized that my friendship with Susie, though cut tragically short, had ultimately led me to a life of advocacy and teaching that I found deeply meaningful, demonstrating how personal tragedy could be transformed into positive action that benefited others. The career change I had made after leaving the estate agent industry had allowed me to work with young people and to share lessons about personal safety that might protect them from becoming victims of violent crime. My involvement with the trust and my continued advocacy for missing person families had connected me to a community of people who understood the importance of turning grief into constructive action rather than allowing it to become destructive bitterness. The skills I had developed through decades of media appearances, police cooperation, and public speaking had made me more effective in my teaching career and had given me unique insights into how tragic events could be processed and understood in ways that generated positive change. While I would obviously trade all of these experiences to have Susie back alive and safe, I had learned that meaning could be found even in the most senseless tragedies if people were willing to work for justice and protection for others. Diana Lampla passed away peacefully just 6 months after Susie's funeral, finally at rest, knowing that her daughter's killer had been brought to justice and that her life's work would continue protecting others through the trust and the safety awareness programs she had created. Diana's death marked the end of an era in the Susie Lampla case. She had been the driving force behind every major development and the inspiration for everyone else who had worked for justice over the decades. Her funeral was attended by an even larger crowd than Susie's had been, reflecting the enormous respect and admiration she had earned through her advocacy work and her transformation of personal grief into public service. The tributes to Diana focused not just on her role as Susie's mother, but on her achievements as a campaigner, educator, and leader who had changed British society's approach to personal safety in missing person cases. Her death was mourned not just by those of us who had known her personally, but by thousands of people whose lives had been improved by her work and by the safety measures she had fought to implement throughout the country. At Diana's funeral, I spoke about how she had shown all of us that love could be transformed into action, and that even the most devastating loss could become a source of protection and hope for others, providing a model for how to respond constructively to personal tragedy. My eulogy focused on Diana's remarkable ability to channel her grief into practical action that generated real benefits for society, rather than allowing herself to be consumed by bitterness or despair over circumstances she couldn't change. I described how she had taken the worst experience a parent could endure and used it as motivation to prevent other families from suffering similar losses, creating an organization that would outlast her own life and continue her mission of protection and advocacy. The speech also acknowledged the personal cost of her advocacy work, the emotional toll of reliving her daughter's disappearance through countless media appearances, police interviews, and public speaking engagements, all in service of keeping Susie's case in the public eye and pushing for the changes that would protect others. Diana's example had taught me that true strength was not about avoiding pain or pretending that tragedy hadn't occurred, but about finding ways to transform suffering into constructive action that honored the memory of those who had been lost. Today, the Susie Lamplugh Trust continues its vital work, and every time I hear about new safety procedures being implemented or a dangerous situation being avoided, I think about my colleague who left for a routine property viewing and never came home, but whose legacy continues to save lives decades later. The Trust's educational programs have evolved with changing technology and new understanding of criminal behavior, but the core mission remains the same: protecting people who work alone or meet unknown clients from becoming victims of violent crime. The organization has expanded its work to include online safety, domestic violence prevention, and international cooperation with similar groups in other countries, demonstrating the universal relevance of the safety principles that emerged from Susie's case. Recent statistics show that workplace violence against people in client-facing professions has decreased significantly since the safety measures inspired by Susie's case were implemented, providing concrete evidence that her death has prevented other tragedies. The Trust's research continues to contribute to academic understanding of criminal behavior and victim protection, ensuring that the lessons learned from Susie's case will inform future safety initiatives and law enforcement strategies. The knowledge that Susie's story continues to generate positive change more than 3 decades after her death provides meaning that helps balance the grief and anger that will always be part of my memories of July 28, 1986, and reminds me that even the most senseless tragedies can become sources of protection and hope if people are willing to work for justice and change. Every safety protocol that prevents an attack, every missing person case that is solved more quickly because of improved procedures, and every family that avoids the agony of uncertainty because of better investigation techniques represents a victory over the forces that destroyed Susie's life and caused so much suffering to those who loved her. The fact that her name is still known throughout the UK and that her case continues to influence policy and practice in law enforcement, workplace safety, and victim advocacy demonstrates that her life had meaning that transcended the circumstances of her death. While nothing can bring Susie back or restore the years that were lost to uncertainty and grief, the knowledge that her legacy continues to protect others provides a sense of purpose and meaning that has sustained me through nearly 4 decades of carrying this burden and will continue to do so for the rest of my life.